Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another video covering our Introduction to Machine Learning workshop for the DSGT Udemy Bootcamp. It's a pleasure to have you today. So in the previous video, we've talked about standard scalar, like the importance of standardizing your data, especially for your X-train and X-test. And we've also talked about what PCA dimension reduction is. So this is, as you recall from the previous video, this is our result of performing PCA on X-train and X-test with two components. Now, the logical question you might ask is, okay, so from this, how do we classify what is survived and not survived from this? And I guess one thing to think about is, well, how would you do this as a human, right? Like, what is the best way indeed to classify? I mean, as a human, we can come up with all these rules, right? But how can we make a computer infer these rules, right? To the best of its ability, right? And that's where machine learning models come in, right? So a machine learning model is essentially a mathematical representation of a real world process, right? So you can think if I'm given an input and a target, what is that function that best, maps the input to the target? So we want to find what is that function, right? That's essentially what the machine learning model is trying to do. So as a recap, there's classification versus regression, right? That we've talked about in workshop 3. So classification algorithms help predict/classify discrete values. So like male or female, true or false, spam or not spam. And these are some of the many models available for classification. So like logistic regression, decision trees, random forest, support vector machines, k-nearest neighbors, naive Bayes. Regression algorithms, on the other hand, are used to predict continuous values. So for example, the price of a house, a person's salary, age, etc. So based on this definition, take 5 seconds to think about what kind of algorithms should we be using for the Titanic dataset to solve our problem, to predict if a person survived or not. I'm sure this question took you like a split second, but we're trying to do a classification problem, right? We want to classify if a person survives or not, 0 or 1, right? So we're going to go through a survey of models, right? And the first machine learning model we'll cover is a decision tree/random forest. So imagine if you have a tree-like model that figures out outcomes based off of existing statistics. So for example, you might have a tree that's kind of like, oh, if age is less than 20, go to the left branch, or if age is not less than 20, go to the right branch. So it's almost like, a series of conditionals. And by going down this tree, you can kind of help, get the classification label, right? So that's what a decision tree is. And one way to think about a decision tree is thinking about the game of 20 questions. So I can ask you a bunch of questions, right? And you want to essentially kind of narrow your possibilities down toward getting the answer, right? So you can ask questions kind of like, what color hair does the person have? But if you ask a question that's kind of like, am I thinking of Michael Jackson, right? That's kind of a waste of a question, right? First off, you've exhausted one question out of 20 questions you could have asked in your limit. And two, knowing the answer to if a person is Michael Jackson or not is very limiting, right? Because if you get the answer of being no, right, then all you know is that the person is not Michael Jackson. But there's like, millions and millions of other people you could be thinking of, right? So you want to ask questions in a strategic way such that you've kind of narrowed down your possibilities for each question you ask, right? And that's exactly what Gini impurity is. So Gini impurity is the probability of incorrectly labeling something. And Gini impurity can help us determine which nodes should we split on first. So is it better to split off by age, or is it better to split off by P class? That's what Gini impurity helps us calculate, right? So if a set of one class of points where the purity is high and the Gini number is small, right? So basically what you want to understand is kind of how pure are your nodes in the decision tree, right? So if you have things that are mixed, that's generally not good. But if you have things that are more homogeneous, that's great because you've narrowed down your possibilities more, right? You want to kind of have your mind figure out, okay, what group am I thinking of, right? And that's what Gini impurity is. And this is the mathematical formula for Gini impurity. I don't think I'll go through this formula. This is something you can read on your own. But you want to use Gini impurity to essentially kind of help narrow down your possibilities and figure out what is the best node to split on at each time, right, in the decision tree, right? So that's what it is, right? And we want to kind of lower our probability of predicting something incorrectly, right? And another type of, statistic you can use to help, or heuristic you can use for decision trees, is something called entropy. And entropy is kind of like the measure of the amount of disorder, right? So you want to tend toward lower entropy, which means you're gaining information intuitively, right? Which is kind of the ideal scenario for a decision tree. And that's kind of what sklearn is trying to do with your data set. So in the next video, we're going to go through an example of a decision tree, like with sklearn. But till then, see you in the next video.